Good morning, everybody. Interesting question. Does God hear our prayer? And it sounds like quite a simple question, but it's a question that has challenges, or possibly challenges that come when we give our response, because depending on our response is what people will hear and what they will think about. Because there is a very short and simple answer to the question, does God hear our prayer? And it's yes, always. And that's where the challenges begin, because not everybody will believe that statement. Not everybody will accept the fact that God hears our prayers. Or if he hears our prayers, he doesn't answer them. Or more accurately, he doesn't answer them the way we expect. He doesn't give the answer that we are looking for. And that's what I'd like to spend a few minutes now looking at. The difference between the outcomes of the prayers that we give, the outcomes that we're expecting, and the actual outcome that God gives. We could have picked any number, or we could look at any number of different prayers through the Bible. We're going to look at maybe 3 or 4, and to see what they can teach us, can show what the prayers were, show what the answer that God gave to that prayer is, or on 1 or 2 of them, why he didn't answer the prayer or give the answer that was looked for. We read together from the book of Nehemiah, close. Nehemiah was a Jew who was taken into captivity with the rest of the Jews from the land of Israel, from Judah, from the kingdom of Judah, when the Babylonians overran the city and carried everybody captive. Now, Nehemiah must have been a nobleman, because he's in a position of authority. Now, we might think of, when we see the title, that Nehemiah was a cupbearer, that he was a wine waiter, or maybe at best a butler. But in the Near East, in this time, the cupbearer was far more than just the man who carried the glass of wine and gave that wine to the king. He was in a privileged position. He was the man who had the safety and the interests of the king at heart. He was the man that was most likely to be tried to be bribed by somebody to poison the king. So because of this position of authority, he becomes almost, or many of them became, the king's confidant. Excuse me. He was there with the king at all times. And so he would become an advisor, and that's why I say possibly he was of noble birth. And so he's there with the king. And in his off time, as we read, he was sitting outside, and he hears of one of his, as it says, his brother comes to tell him, comes to Babylon, and he goes and he asks him, and we read there, what's Jerusalem like? They've gone to rebuild it. What's Jerusalem like? And he's given the answer. It's still in ruins. All his hopes, expectations, gone. When I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned certain days, and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. That was his response to the answer he was given. And then verses 5 to 11 gives us the prayer, the entreaty that Nehemiah makes to God. Now, the thing to note is he sat and he prayed. And he carried on his work. It was troubling him. It was playing on his mind that Jerusalem was in this state. And we give him 2 dates, 2 important dates. We read the first in chapter 1 and verse 1. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah, and it came to pass in the month Chislev. So that's the first date to remember. Turn over the page to chapter 2, and again verse 1. And it came to pass in the month Nisan. So we have 2 dates, 2 calendar dates, and they're approximately 4 months apart. So there's a 4-month period when Nehemiah is thinking about the answer he got to his question about the state of Jerusalem. Now we're told there in chapter 1 that Nehemiah prayed. And I'm sure you'd agree with me, that probably wasn't going to be the only occasion Nehemiah prayed to God about the state of Israel. I'm sure he prayed continually to ask God why things were as they were in the state of Jerusalem, why it was the state it was in. And we've got evidence of Nehemiah praying often in verse 6 of chapter 1, where he asks God, "Let thine ear now be attentive and thine eyes open, that thou mayest hear the prayer of thy servant, which I pray before thee now, day and night." There was no opportunity that Nehemiah didn't take to pray to God to see whether he would do anything about the state of Jerusalem. And as we saw there in chapter 2 and verse 1, 4 months later, he's doing his job as the wine bearer. And he comes before the king, and chapter 2 and verse 1, continuing, we read, "I took up the wine and gave it unto the king. Now I had not been before time sad in his presence. Wherefore the king said unto me, Why is thy countenance sad, seeing thou art not sick? This is nothing else but sorrow of heart. Then I was so afraid." Although he held this privileged position, he couldn't be sad in front of the king. That wasn't his role. But I wonder how long the king had noticed that Nehemiah wasn't his usual self. Why he wasn't the man he knew, and his condition got worse. We're not told, but it obviously the king had noticed this. So that's how I think important Nehemiah was to the king, that he noticed these things and asked what was the problem. And the chapter 2 continues by the king asking Nehemiah, "For what dost thou make request?" Having been told, my home city is in disrepair. For what dost thou make request? And Nehemiah's answer was not a spur of the moment reaction, was it? It wasn't a case of, "Oh, I wonder." He'd been praying for at least 4 months that God would do something about the state of Jerusalem. And we're told that Nehemiah prayed. "So I pray to the God of heaven." Not a formal prayer as we witnessed with Richard just now. I would suggest it was a very short prayer. A prayer from the mind to God, not spoken, and something to the extent of saying thank you to God that he had heard his prayer. Here was Nehemiah's opportunity to see if he could get the king to let him go back and to sort out the rebuilding of Jerusalem, which is what happened. And so Nehemiah, and the chapter in rest of the book of Nehemiah tells us of him going back and to sort out the rebuilding of Jerusalem. And so Nehemiah continued his prayer. As I say, I think Nehemiah was a man of prayer, to thank God for the opportunities he's had and for looking after him. And we can take lessons from these prayers. And another man whose prayers are recorded was the prophet Elijah. Now, Elijah was the man who was sent to challenge King Ahab, Jezebel, his wife, and the prophets of Baal that they'd set up to corrupt the worship of the people of God, the nation of Israel. Now, technically, I say technically, and I'll explain why in a minute, we have 4 prayers of Elijah given to us in the book of Kings. There are 2 that relate to him telling Ahab at the beginning of First Kings, that of the chapter in Kings, that there will be no more rain. The second one says 3.5 years later, get back to Jerusalem, the rain is going to come. The third is recorded of when he prays that the son of the widow with who he was staying during the drought God would raise her son from the dead. And the fourth, when he challenges the prophets of Baal to sacrifice, and he calls on God to send fire down to consume the sacrifice, which happened. Now, the reason I said technically at the beginning, because the 2 prayers regarding rain are not actually mentioned in Kings. We find mention of that in the New Testament when James is talking about prayer and how prayer can work. So if you'll turn me please to James and chapter 5. James chapter 5. And towards the end of the chapter, in verse 17, Elias, or the New Testament version of Elijah, was a man subject to like passions as we are. And he prayed earnestly that it might not rain. And it rained not on the earth by the space of 3 years and 6 months. And he prayed again, and the heaven gave rain, and the earth brought forth her fruit. So James is telling us the prayers and the time scale that it covered 3.5 years of drought. And again, Elijah was a man like Nehemiah who just didn't pray when there was a problem. He would spend time in prayer to God to give thanks for all the things that God had given him, to ask God to do certain things, as in this case, to show to the people that he was the God. And the 2 signs with the prayers regarding the rain and the prayer regarding the incident with the prophets of Baal, all would show the people that here was a man who could be depended on, and more importantly, that the God he prayed to was the important one. His prayer, the fourth prayer that comes in 1 Kings chapter 18, is a challenge for the people to either believe in Baal, the idol, the false god, or to believe in God. Now, Baal was believed to be the god of rain and of storms. And that during the summer, the hot summer months, Baal was either resting or he was away on a journey. And at your leisure, if you like to read 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 27, we find Elijah taunting the prophets of Baal for them to cry louder to him, because he was either sleeping or he was away on a journey. And the outcome is nothing happened. So he prayed to God. When he then set up the altar and he put the sacrifice on it, and he prayed to God that he would send fire down to consume the sacrifice, which is exactly what happens, and you can read that in Kings. And the idea then would be that the people would believe that the God that Elijah prayed to, the God of heaven and earth, was the only true God. He was the only one who heard the call of his prophet. And as I say, Elijah, as we read about his life, was a man who was constantly in prayer with God. Now, if we come to the New Testament, we find, again, lots of prayers mentioned there, but I'm going to look at the prayers of two men who made requests in prayer, and the request that they asked for was turned down. Turn me please to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Second Corinthians 12 and verse 7. And this is the Apostle Paul. He's praying to God. Verse 7. He's prayed to God that the thorn in the flesh be taken away. Let's start in verse 6. For though I would desire to glory, I shall not be a fool, for I will say the truth. But now I forbear lest any man should think of me above that which he seeth me to be, or that he heareth of me. And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelation, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distress, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Now, we're not told what the thorn in the flesh are, and there are many opinions about what it is. But whatever it is, or whatever it was, Paul saw it as a hindrance to him doing God's work. If he didn't have this thorn in the flesh, whatever it was, he could do so much more. And God says, no. Because if you can do all this extra, either you might start to think, I'm good at this, and get ideas above what he should be. Or if he didn't think it, then other people might think, this man's wonderful. But because of this thorn in the flesh, because of whatever it was, he had to depend on God for his help. And that's the prayer he got, the response to the prayer he got. And he was happy with that response once he understood what God's plan was for him. And then we come to the second one. Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Turn back a few pages to the Gospel of John and chapter 11. Here we have Jesus at the tomb of his friend Lazarus. He knew that Lazarus was dead, and he waited 3 days before he went to the tomb. And as he stands at the entrance, he asks for the stone in front of it to be taken away. And he makes this prayer. Verse 41. Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead was laid. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank thee that thou hearest me. And I know that thou hearest me always. But because of the people which stand by, I said it, that they may believe that thou hast sent me. And when he thus had spoken, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And he that was dead came forth, bound hand and foot. He prayed to God so that the people would hear the prayer, see the response, and believe in God. And there's a lesson for us that we can pray to God, and he will hear our prayer, and might not always, as in this case, answer our prayers, because that's the second of the prayers I'd like to look at regarding Jesus. This time, a prayer that he made that wasn't responded in the positive outcome that the prayer suggests. Back a few pages again to Mark chapter 14, please. Mark 14, verse 32. And this is Jesus and his disciples. And they came to a place which was named Gethsemane, and said to his disciples, sit here while I shall pray. And then verse 35. And he went forward a little and fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible unto thee. Take away this cup from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but thou wilt be. He makes his prayer. He goes back to his disciples on 3 occasions, and each time he finds them asleep. He prayed that the cup, the fate that awaited him, the trial and the crucifixion would pass away, that the hour might pass from me. But Jesus knew the fate that awaited him. His purpose was to do God's will, and so the prayer wouldn't be answered. But because of his belief and his trust in God, 3 days later, he would rise from the tomb. He didn't complain that God hadn't answered his prayer. He didn't complain that God hadn't taken this cup away from him. He accepted God's decision, knowing that what God had in store for him, and the same will be for us, is the best for us. It might not be what we were thinking, but it's what God knows is best for us. Now, we're told in Thessalonians that we should pray without ceasing. We should pray for the peace of Jerusalem. We put our prayers before God, and having put our problems before God, we let him sort them out for us and to deliver us in whatever way he sees right for us. But if we pray without ceasing, and we pray that we pray for the peace of Jerusalem, then we have a hope of a place in God's kingdom if we follow his instructions. Because if we believe that God answers our prayers, that God will look after us through our lives, then we can pray that prayer that Jesus taught his disciples, and we can pray it in the sure knowledge that God will answer that prayer in his time. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Thank you.